Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Yo voy a hacer una brevísima introducción. La verdad es que para nosotros es un auténtico honor y un privilegio tener los invitados que tenemos hoy aquí para hablar de Ucrania y América Latina y además hacerlo en el momento más oportuno. En el momento más oportuno, well, I don't know if I should do it in English. It's in the best timing to do it. The best timing to do it. Why? Because you know that during the last 2 days, the relations between Latin America and Europe has been launched again. We had the first summit of both regions in 8 years. And we are having this when we have again war in the European soil, in the borders of Europe and against the principles that has built the European institutions during the last 70 years of integration. Basically, after 45, we decided the Europeans no more paint borders by the force, no more to the right of conquer. When we have conflicts, we sit at a table and we discuss under institutions and always based in rules and the respect to rules. This was the path to build 70 years of prosperity, development, peace, social convergence, and this is what is jeopardized now in Ukraine, and this is what is under threat. And we want to talk with the campaign Aguanta Ucrania, with the protagonists that they suffered in Ukraine also the attacks of Russia, to talk about the position of Latin America, why it's so important for Latin America, what is happening in Ukraine and for the global world order, why Latin America should have a clear position about this, and why Latin America should play an important role. The protagonists here, and especially also Gilmore, the High Representative on Human Rights of the European Union, and 3 protagonists, journalist, writer, and a peacemaker, that they were building this campaign and also suffer. And it's a special also day to think about the deaths, the civilians, the real protagonists of the suffering in Ukraine. Nothing more. For me, host this event, it's really, really a privilege, a real privilege, and it's a conversation that must have the European institutions and we have with the Latin Americans, because it's a conversation about the humanity and the dignity of the humanity. Al Sergio Jaramillo continuará moderando el acto, no necesita presentación. Como bien sabéis, fue embajador de Colombia aquí, en la Unión Europea, y uno de los protagonistas de las mejores noticias que ha alumbrado el mundo en las últimas décadas, que es el acuerdo de paz de La Habana entre las FARC y Colombia.
Muchas gracias, Javi. Vamos esas primeras intervenciones a hacerlas en inglés y después miramos cómo hacemos. So thank you very much, Javi, for organizing this. Thank you very much to the European Parliament. We could not be happier with our friends to be here, happier than you can imagine after everything that happened. But I want to actually begin by thanking the European Parliament, not just for the invitation today, but for all the support we had in Colombia at the time when I was High Commissioner for Peace. And the Parliament, united from left to right, consistently voted in favor of supporting Colombia. And the best example of this is the man to my left, Eamon Gilmore, who was a brilliant special representative, went and is still going to Colombia showing this support. And so we Colombians really have received a lot of support, a lot of solidarity, and we think it's time for us to give some of this back, some of this solidarity back. Now, our movement, Aguanta Ucrania, is precisely not about being on the left or the right. It is not about taking geopolitical sides, but it's about taking the sides of the victims and not of the aggressor. It's about taking the side of those who uphold the UN Charter and not of those who violate it. It's about taking the side of Ukraine. Almost exactly 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday at 7:30 p.m., Catalina, Héctor, Dima, our driver, and Victoria Melina, we sat down for a pizza in Kramatorsk. And the Russians launched an Iskander missile on our pizzeria. And after that, some people have asked, in Colombia have asked, well, what on earth were you doing in Kramatorsk? Why were you there? And we say, we were there because we wanted to see for ourselves what's going on. We wanted to record for ourselves what's happening and to give Ukrainians voice in Latin America, and we've put out some of his testimonies on our networks, but above all, we were there again to express our solidarity, as has been done by over 100 major writers, musicians, film directors that have recorded messages condemning the invasion and expressing their solidarity with Ukraine, people as different as Gioconda Belli of Nicaragua, Ana Garcia Vergo of Mexico, Leonardo Padura of Cuba, Juan Gabriel Vázquez of Colombia, naturally Héctor here to my left, Alonso Cueto of Peru, Pablo Simonetti of Chile, Milton Atum of Brazil, plus musicians like Jorge Drexler, like Fonseca, and more recently, more and more leading human rights figures of Latin America, very distinguished former presidents of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, like Claudio Grossman of the Court of Human Rights, like Diego Garcia Sayan, have come out speaking against the invasion because we want to show the world that we care, that Latin America cares. And we care because we also have our own reasons as Latin Americans for caring. And I will just tell you 2 stories of the many people who have come out and supported us and joined the movement, of why, as they said themselves, Ukraine may seem to be very far, but it's actually very close to us. And the first is former president of Uruguay, Sanguinetti, who in a video that we are about to publish, said something very simple but very powerful. He said, Uruguay is a tiny country. We're surrounded by huge neighbors, Brazil and Argentina. And we've had 2 centuries of peace. Why is that? That is because we respect each other's sovereignty. That is because we all respect international law. And we use the mechanisms of international law to solve our differences. That is because we all respect and uphold the UN Charter. So Ukraine may seem far, but it's actually very close to us, to our protection, to our security. And the second is precisely from Claudio Grossman that I mentioned a moment ago, very, very distinguished human rights lawyer who in the 70s used to go and visit political prisoners in the Chilean prisons under Pinochet. Claudio reminded us that it was Latin America who insisted on, when the Rome Statute was being discussed in '97, insisted in having the crime of force disappearance be part of the statute. That was a Latin American contribution. And he reminded us how that today that is precisely what's happening in Ukraine. Everywhere where there are Russian troops, Ukrainians are being abducted and are being killed. And you are going to see one such story today of a poet and children's book writer, Vladimir Vakulenko, who was abducted and killed. And we know about that in Latin America because a lot of people were abducted and killed in Argentina and in Chile and in Mexico and in my own country, Colombia. So we care and we want to raise our voice. Now, we don't want to say that Ukraine matters more than everything else in the world. This is not a question of which victims are more important. This is not a competition. And I don't want to take this moment to say that we need to keep paying attention to all other conflicts and all other victims in the world. I spend my time trying to do that, trying to help people negotiate peace agreements to end conflicts. But there is a difference here. There's a major difference here, which is not just that a superpower has decided to invade its neighbor, is that Russia is using all its military might to intentionally and systematically target and kill civilians in Ukraine. And this is completely and utterly unacceptable. We in Colombia know a lot about this because we had an internal armed conflict. In a previous life, I was in Colombia Deputy Minister of Defense, also National Security Advisor, and we worked very, very hard on issues of international humanitarian law and the conduct of operations. And what I can say to you is that Russia is, first of all, entirely in breach of the most obvious obligations. I will just read to you the language, for example, of Article 51 of Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, which says, the civilian population as such shall not be the object of attack. Acts of violence whose primary purpose is to spread terror are prohibited. And this is what Russia does every day in Ukraine. It commits war crimes every day. And these are actually, if you think about it, not just war crimes, these are crimes against humanity in the language of the Article 7 of the Rome Statute, because they're being committed in a widespread and systematic manner consistently against the civilian population. This is happening intentionally. But I actually think that this is all still worse, because it's not just simply a matter of not observing the sacrosanct principles of the law of war, such as the principle of distinction and the principle of proportionality and the principle of caution. That is not the only problem. The problem is that we have a superpower that is a permanent member of the Security Council, and as such should be upholding international law, should be protecting the international order, that systematically targets and kills civilians and that intentionally is running a policy of terror in Ukraine. And in my opinion, Russia is behaving like a terrorist state, and I mean that in a legal sense, and it's high time that the world, and we Latin Americans, start treating it as such, as a country that does not want to be part of the community of nations. Now, we saw this with our own eyes because we were sitting there in this pizzeria. We saw the families, we saw the journalists, we saw the children running up and down the corridors. We also saw soldiers who were there with their girlfriends having a break. And we lost our very dear friend, Victoria, who was sitting right to my left. And we have to repeat again and again, as you may have seen in the streets of Brussels, Victoria Amelina was a civilian. Today we come to pay tribute to Victoria, who put her writing career on hold and became an investigator of war crimes and ended up being a victim of a war crime herself. In the video that you're going to watch in a minute, you will see this is the last recorded interview of hers, which we did with Héctor. She was talking about this poet, Vladimir Vakulenko, who was abducted and killed and whose diary she found after speaking to her father in the garden. And she tells us the story of this. And she says, as you will hear, that she thinks that the Russians didn't just want to kill a Ukrainian patriot, they wanted to destroy Ukrainian culture. And this is precisely what happened with Victoria. This is precisely what Victoria's death means, the destruction of Ukrainian culture. So we're facing something that the world, frankly, has not seen since the Second World War. This level of barbarity has not been seen since the Second World War. And we ask all Latin Americans and no Latin American governments to raise their voice and condemn this barbaric invasion. So now with you, our dear friend Victoria Amelina. We're going to show you, it's a little bit long, we apologize. It's about 15 minutes. We ask 15 minutes of your patience to listen to her last testimony, her last interview. Perhaps the lights.
Hola amigas y amigos, esto es Aguanta Ucrania desde Ucrania. Hoy estamos a las afueras de la ciudad de Izium, que fue teatro de unos combates terribles como consecuencia de la invasión rusa desde el mes de marzo, pero luego meses más tarde, en septiembre, Ucrania con su contraofensiva logró expulsar a los rusos y lo que se vio, lo que se develó tras la salida corriendo de esas tropas fue la absoluta destrucción de la ciudad, más del 80%, y como ya lo hemos dicho y visto en otras partes, la destrucción de su población. Más fosas comunes se encontraron en los bosques, más de 400 cuerpos. Y dentro de estas historias, hoy les queremos hablar de la historia de Volodymyr Vakulenko, un poeta y escritor de libros, de cuentos de niños, que vivía en esta casa, que plantó este jardín. Es una historia muy triste porque él fue desaparecido por los rusos y luego asesinado, pero es una historia también de esperanza porque él quiso dejar el testimonio de lo que estaba viendo para que futuras generaciones no olvidaran lo que pasó. Y con nosotros están hoy nuevamente Victoria Amelina, que jugó un papel central en el descubrimiento de este diario, y Héctor Abad Faciolince, que va a dialogar con Victoria sobre esta historia inimaginable para todos nosotros. Héctor.
Victoria, Volodymyr Vakulenko was a poet, was a writer. He planted this vine, probably, and that tree over there, the tree of cherries. Cherries are probably the fruits of Ukraine. And you know from his father that down that tree of cherries, he planted something different. And it was the prospect of a book, prospect of fear of him. Can you tell us, how did you discover these diaries?
I started talking to Volodymyr's father not only about the abduction of his son, but also about what his son did while he was with him. So we started talking about Volodymyr's writing, and this is when Volodymyr's father remembered that Volodymyr was writing even during the occupation, and that he hid this diary a day before he was finally taken away and never came back. So we started searching together with Volodymyr's father, and I found this diary here. And it is now basically becoming a book. This book will be available in Ukraine for sale in July. The diary was not so big. It's 6,000 words because Volodymyr Vakulenko entered the diary on March 21st on the Poetry Day, and the last words in the diary are about the International Poetry Day and about the fact that on that day he sees the birds in the sky, and it seems to him that even the birds are saying that he believes I believe in victory.
You brought the diaries to the Literature Museum in Kharkiv. And in that museum, there are many writers who were also killed a long time ago. But now the diaries and the memory of Volodymyr are together with those old poets. That's plenty of meaning. Why did you take the diaries there?
Exactly, because I saw this connection between the executed Renaissance, between the generation of Ukrainian writers and artists which were executed by the Soviet regime in 1930s. And I have to tell you that while looking for the diary in this Black Ukrainian soil, I was really afraid that I wouldn't be able to find it. And this will be another Ukrainian manuscript lost, because unfortunately not all manuscripts, not all books of the writers executed during the Soviet times survived. Some of the, for example, the second half of a novel by Mykola Khvylevy was published in the magazine. There was 1,000 of copies of that magazine, but Soviet regime managed to destroy all the copies. So we only have the first half and we don't have the second half. So Ukrainian manuscripts do burn, as we know, and I was afraid that this manuscript could also be lost, like many, many others. But fortunately, we have it.
Okay, thank you. Maybe this is also in this terrible tradition that one Russian poet said that in Russia, they take poetry very seriously. They kill you because of a poem. Probably he was killed because of his writing, because of his position as a Ukrainian national writer.
I think we're all targeted not as writers, we're people of other professions. He was killed because he was Ukrainian, because he chose to be Ukrainian.
Thank you, Victoria. The diary was under this small tree. And you took something to...
I had a shovel.
It was in plastic.
In plastic bag. You still use them sometimes. They are forbidden in many countries, but we still use them.
How many pages?
I think it has 36 pages.
36?
Yeah, it's 6,000 words, around 6,000 words, because we already have it transcribed.
Okay. Now there are some cherries here.
Yeah.
Let's try one cherry. That's strawberry, but I'm sorry.
You're already intruding, so.
And you were the one who found the diaries.
Yeah,
the father told you it is more or less in this area.
He actually tried to find it himself, but couldn't, and said that I don't know why it's not here. Maybe come another day. So he looked very desperate, and I kept looking. And
but the father told.
You were the one who found the diary.
Sorry.
You found the diary.
Yeah.
Yes, but the father told you that
Yes,
the son told him that give the diary to a writer, to a friend of mine.
No. He told just in Ukrainian there's the word ours, like our guys. It means it's perhaps, but it has no gender. It's like ours. Give it to when our come.
Okay.
Our people
Our
come.
people.
Give it to them.
So, and the father consider you our people. In some
Más
ways.
linda.
Okay.
Well, I was the first one who came to him after the
Oh,
liberation.
good. You never met him before, the writer.
I met him once, but very briefly, so we were just
Okay.
colleagues, not friends.
And he used to write children books.
Yes, he was primarily a children's writer. He had a son, Vitalik, and when Vitalik was about 2 or 3 years old, the parents realized he has autism syndrome. So this connection with the child was very important for Volodymyr, and he tried to write for him, basically. His most famous book is called Daddy's Book, and it is a book of poems addressed to a little boy. And obviously,
beautiful. And the boy is still with Yulia.
The boy is with Olena, Volodymyr's mother.
Okay, Yulia is
just a librarian and my friend.
Okay. She's not a relative.
No, she's not a relative. She's just because I was coming a lot to this village and we became friends.
Okay.
She was just in Kyiv at the Book Arsenal, by the way, because the Book Arsenal Pan-Ukraine actually made an event for librarians from the villages which were occupied, and libraries suffered, of course, during the occupation. So they invited librarians to tell their stories. So Yulia is just back from Kyiv as well.
And do you think that when the Russians arrived, he discussed with them? He was very openly opposing there, or they just know that he was a nationalist Ukrainian or something?
He tried to be careful, and he writes about this in his diary, that he would be more brave, but he has a child and he has to think about the child's safety, and that is why he was careful. But Russians always, I document war crimes, so I know the pattern. They always look for people who could defend the community, who would be active in the community, and
who could write or talk very well or something like that.
So they target not only writers, but they would target teachers as well, policemen, mayors, definitely. So it's very dangerous for mayors to stay in the occupied village because, for example, in the Kyiv region, in Matizhin, Russian occupiers came and killed both the mayor, female mayor, and her husband and her son. So we have terrible stories like that. Some of the mayors are detained and tortured, but then let go. So perhaps Russians consider that they are broken now and they won't resist and do anything to protect people and keep basically this Ukrainian identity in the community. So they look for people who the people which, if you destroy them, then community will be much weaker and more obedient.
So Yulia could be also endangered in those days.
I'm sure she was in danger. She doesn't like talking about that, but I know that she was in danger.
Of course, and we know that they took many children away, and of course, they don't kill the children because they want to give the children to Russian families.
The children Russian, yeah.
Yes, but we didn't have so clearly know that they also took away adults alive that never came back.
Of course, they detained a lot of people in this region, in Izum, in Balaklia, for example, in the town of Balaklia, and this is a town of 40,000 people. Only organization I work for, it's Truth Hounds NGO. We identified more than 300 civilian prisoners, mainly men, but also some women who were detained and tortured with electricity.
Different ages. Old people, young people.
Yes, old people, young people. Definitely, if you served in the army, this would make you a target, despite the fact that serving in the army several years ago, or decades ago, doesn't make you a military now.
We're going to ask you for just 1 minute of silence for Victoria. Thank you very much. So now we're going to hear Héctor first and then Catalina tell us about what we lived through and what they think of all of this.
Last May in Lillehammer, Norway, Volodymyr Vakulenko was awarded a special prize from the International Publishers Association. Victoria Amelina received the award on his name and she said, I am a Ukrainian writer speaking on behalf of my colleague who, unlike me, didn't survive another attempt of the Russian Empire to erase Ukrainian identity. Today, I can say that I am a Colombian writer speaking on behalf of my colleague, Victoria Amelina, who, unlike me, unlike us, didn't survive another attempt of the Russian Empire to erase Ukrainian culture. Perhaps you now are asking yourselves, but why a Colombian writer is speaking on behalf of an Ukrainian poet? And maybe you are also asking yourselves, what the hell were doing 3 crazy Colombians there in Kramatorsk? I will tell you what and why. There were many Norwegians in Colombia during our peace process. There were some Irish people in our peace process. And this man here, Sergio Jaramillo, and many others achieved a big amount of peace among us thanks to that Norwegian, Irish, Spanish people. They didn't feel too far away from Colombia, and we don't feel too far away from Ukraine. Do you know, we are not only drug and cocaine traffickers. We are not exactly a banana republic. We are not only apt to write novels about bloody and crazy dictators. We, in Colombia, down there, we are probably the far west of the Western world. And also there, in the high mountains of the Andes, the seeds of freedom, democracy, and liberalism flourished like a cherry tree, like a coffee tree. We are here to remember you, Europeans, And you Latin American leaders who are around here, I think, that your union, the European Union, and you, our independent countries, were achieved for the sake of freedom against despotism, for the sake of free thinking, free talking, free press, free trade, free movement, and for safety and privacy in our homes. Everything that Hitler denied, everything that Mussolini denied, and Stalin denied, everything that Putin denies today to Russians, and also wants to deny Ukrainians, destroying them and their culture. It is absolutely clear that when we are speaking for Ukrainians, we Colombians, when we are speaking for Ukrainians, we are speaking also for ourselves. And much more important that when Ukrainians are fighting for themselves, they are fighting for we all and for the future of the world.
Thank you very, very much, Héctor. So now we're going to listen to Catalina, who of all of us was the person who by far knew Victoria best, traveled with her in the Donbass, I shall tell you, and is, in my view, one of the great war correspondents of the world. Catalina.
Let me tell you a little bit about the story of amazing friend, an amazing poet, writer, but especially a special person that was Victoria. And as the majority of Ukrainians in February of last year, she didn't really believe that Vladimir Putin was going to invade Ukraine. Then she decided to buy a ticket with her son, Andrei, and she went to Egypt to escape from the coldest days in Kiev and in Lviv. And she was there the night that Ukraine was invaded. Then the following day, she went to the airport. She has a flight to where? To Kiev. What is Kiev? There is no airport to go to Kiev. There is no airport to go. She was in a country that was not her country, but she was also in no place. Who was going to take Victoria? Then she started looking for a flight to go to Poland. At the beginning, it was difficult to find because the visa, because you are not going, and so on. Then she found a way, and she arrived in Poland, and the Polish woman saw her passport, Ukrainian, and said, "Welcome to Poland." And she said, "I was not just welcome to Poland, I was welcome to Europe, my house." But the story doesn't finish over there, because meanwhile, millions of Ukrainians were leaving Ukraine, trying to arrive to these borders close to Poland, in the way to Warsaw, to America, to all these borders. We saw the image of mothers, grandmothers, sons, and also fathers bringing their families just to the border and went back to defend their country. She crossed the border in the way to Lviv. She saw all that image, how long were the queues of people trying to escape. But she went to Lviv, not because she wanted to pick up her mother, that it was one of the reasons. She went to Lviv to open the doors of her house, to receive all friends who were escaping from Kiev, and to start helping in the way she could. As I could say, most of the Ukrainians were doing. Recollecting money, collecting food, collecting clothes, helping all these families escaping. That I entered the country 1 week after. I could say there were kilometers and kilometers and kilometers of people in these cars trying to escape and to arrive to these borders. and she started helping. But after a month, for her was not enough, because Victoria, as we say and as we talk with her, it's like she took Ukraine like her son, her daughter. She wanted to do as much as she could, not just to protect Ukrainians, to protect Ukraine and to help them. Then she started researching and learning how to research about war crimes, because it's not something that you do from one day to another. You have to prepare yourself, you know how to do these interviews, you know how to approach the victims to collect all this information. And she knew exactly that as many and more precise questions you make, the case will be stronger in the moment you are going to beat up the accusations against the perpetrator. Russia, she had it very clear. But she has one frustration. She said that the war crimes investigators don't need to go very close to the field. I mean, they can talk with the victims from far away, 100 kilometers, 50 kilometers. It's not really necessary to go to the place. And for her, as a writer, poet, researcher, was very important to go to the field. Then it's coming, when I met her in Cartagena in January, in the High Festival, we were doing an interview about Ukraine. And when we finished, she said, I want to go to Bakhmut, but I can't, because to go to Bakhmut, of course, you need a special permission from the army. We journalists, we have it, but also we need to ask for permission, but for us, it's... Then she said, would you take me? And I say, I have the permission. Of course, in that moment, Bakhmut was the most awful battle probably in the last decades in Europe. I have been, like 1 week before I talked to Victoria, I was in Bakhmut, and I say, but it's very complicated. But then she says something, take me to New York. New York is a little town in Donbass, very close to Bakhmut, where in 2021, she created a literary festival. It was her son, Andrei, and this literary festival. But what was the point? When she was creating this New York Literary Festival, she spent so many days in Kramatorsk and so many hours in Ria restaurant, talking to authorities, talking to people, talking to her colleagues, most of them from New York, to create. And don't forget that in 2014, Ukraine was in war and Donbass was in war. And New York was not more than 25 kilometers from the front line. But she wanted to take all these Ukrainian writers to New York to understand what Donbass was, because many of them have never been in Donbass. And she kept repeating, that time we went to New York, and this time she come back with us. I can't believe that many people in Ukraine don't know Donbass. This is such a beautiful and beautiful land. And she was telling that when she wrote these writers, they were totally in love with Donbass. Then just to tell this is that Victoria was a person who was totally in love, not just with Ukrainians, with the culture. She was saying they are not destroying us as ethnicity, they are destroying us as a culture. But she was totally in love with her country, and she said that we need to protect all our country, because I can tell people from New York, eventually that is taken to Poso, or now people from Bakhmut, or people from Donetsk and from Crimea, that they are not allowed to come back to their land, because we need to protect them. And we need to protect also the Ukrainians who are there, who are being taken like war prisoners, and also are being tortured like other people that we knew. Then this is a little bit a briefing of the story of Victoria.
Thank
you very much, Catalina. You mentioned her son. She left behind a 12-year-old son, and we do want to say that all of us, the family and her son, been in our thoughts. Catalina stayed behind, if you allow me to say this, stayed behind in Kramatorsk at the hospital with her, was in the ambulance that took her then to Dnipro, was then at the ceremony in Kiev, was then at the funeral in Lviv, was there all the time. And even then, the Russians bombed a residential building that very evening, killed more than 10 and injured more than 40. It continues. We're now going to watch a short video, of Oleksandra Matviichuk, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, who has been with our movement since the very beginning, Cartagena. She really wanted to come here, but she had previously committed to something else. And she was very sad, but she kindly sent us this, which we're going to watch.
I want to say something. Before being a Nobel Peace Prize, Alexander is a very good friend of Victoria, and she was really affected by when her friend was killed.
My name is Oleksandra Matviichuk. I'm a Ukrainian human rights lawyer, head of the Center for Civil Liberties. I have been applying the law to defend people and human dignity for many years. At present, I and other Ukrainian human rights colleagues are doing our job during large-scale Russian invasion. Russia started this war 9 years ago, when Ukraine obtained a chance for the quick democratic transformation after the collapse of the authoritarian regime due to Revolution of Dignity. We got a chance to build the country where the rights of everybody are protected, government is accountable, judiciary is independent, and police do not beat students who are peacefully demonstrating. And in order to stop us on this way, Russia started this war of aggression, occupied Crimea, part of Lugansk and Donetsk regions, and last year extended this war to the large-scale invasion. Because Putin is not afraid of NATO. Putin is afraid of the idea of freedom. And now Russia uses war crimes as the methods of warfare. Russia attempts to break people's resistance and occupy Ukraine by the tool which I call the immense pain of civilian population. We document this pain. When Russian troops deliberately shelling residential buildings, schools, churches, hospitals, attack evacuation corridors, manage filtration camps system, organize forcible deportations, commit murders, torture, rapes, abductions, and other kind of offenses against civilians. And the entire UN system can't stop such Russian atrocities. I witness how quickly this war turned people into the numbers, because the scale of war crimes grows so large that it's become impossible to recognize all the stories. But I will tell you one. This is a story of my dearest friend, Ukrainian writer Victoria Amelina. She was an extremely brave woman. She regularly visited East to document Russian war crimes. When Russian rocket hit a cafe in Kramatorsk, Victoria was there together with our friends, Colombian writers and journalists. Doctors struggled for her life for several days, but she died. Victoria documented Russian war crimes and became a victim of one of them. She knew that she can't change this war by her own efforts, but without her own efforts, nothing will be changed. So what I want to tell with this example, I know from my own experience, when you can't rely on international system of peace and security, you can still rely on people. So I will use this opportunity to apply to people in different countries of Latin America and their leaders with the call for solidarity. Ukraine is far away, but very close to our common values. We are fighting for freedom, and only spread of freedom make our world safer. Awanda, Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Oleksandra. And Oleksandra, whom, as you see, is an absolutely remarkable person, is not the only Ukrainian in the room today. We are honored with the President of the Ambassador. Thank you very much for coming, Ambassador, as well as the Ambassador of the Czech Republic, who's kindly come as well. And now with a great friend, Eamon Gilmore, who is going to give us the EU perspective as Special Representative for Human Rights.
Thank you, Sergio. I was interested to listen to both you and Javi at the beginning of the meeting, drawing comparisons and parallels with the end of the Second World War. And I want to thank you for your kind references to my own role as the European Union Special Envoy for the peace process in Colombia. And in that capacity, I remember on many occasions, and we used to refer to the Colombian conflict as the biggest conflict in the Western Hemisphere. I remember in the many discussions that I had with many people in Colombia, talking about the experience of Europe and talking about how Europe had been pulled apart, destroyed by wars, particularly in the first half of the 20th century, and how we had built a reconciled European Union, and how we, in addition to the United Nations structures, we had also built institutions like the Council of Europe, like the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which I once had the honor of chairing, to prevent wars from ever happening again in Europe. And at the time that I was working in Colombia, I could not have imagined that war would return again to Europe, that we would see scenes reminiscent of what happened in World War II, that we would see and experience the atrocities that were reminiscent of World War II. And not just that war had returned, but that the conduct of war by Russia involved such a scale of the breaking of international law, the violation of international humanitarian law, the commission of war crimes. It's now more than 500 days since February 24th, 2022, and the war of aggression by Ukraine, or the war of aggression by Russia against Ukraine, which has involved indiscriminate shelling of Ukraine's civil infrastructure and civilians, including the attack on the pizzeria in Kramatorsk, where you were dining on that fateful evening of the 27th of June. I was in Kramatorsk a few months before February 2022. I was there in October of 2021. And in Kramatorsk and in the neighboring villages around Kramatorsk, I saw apartments that had been bombed. I met people who had lost limbs, who had lost loved ones. Because I think we need to remember that this war of aggression against Ukraine was going on for quite some time before February the 22nd, February 24th, 2022. And the response of the European Union to that war of aggression is really threefold. First, to provide support for Ukraine, military support, political, diplomatic, financial support, 70 billion euros to date, to do whatever it takes and for however long it takes for Ukraine to prevail. And the second part of the European Union's response is to welcome Ukraine as a member of our family of member states, and to say to Ukraine and to Ukrainians that your future, when this hell is over, will be part of our family within the European Union. And the third part of what we are trying to do is to make accountable those who are responsible for the war crimes in Ukraine, for every civilian and individual who has been killed, who has been violated, and who has been injured. And that's why we support the work of the ICC. That's why we have extended the role of Eurojust in the collection of evidence. That's why we're working with the United States and the United Kingdom in the ACA to support the building of the cases to be taken. It's why we support the decision taken at the Council of Europe summit in Iceland a couple of weeks ago to establish the register for reparations, and it is why we are continuing to work on the tribunal on the issue of the aggression. But of course, as has already been said, we also have to remember that unfortunately these days, the war of aggression in Ukraine is not the only conflict that the world is experiencing. And we think too of those people in Ethiopia, Tigray, who have suffered and who call out for accountability. What is happening these days in Sudan and in the Sahel, what is happening in Myanmar, the women of Afghanistan who are suffering oppression. And the thread, I think, that runs through all of that is the sense of humanity that we all share. I want finally to say how much and how touched I was by the video that you showed, and the words of Victoria AMELINA. And if you'll permit me, Sergio, because she used a phrase in the interview in which she talked about the birds in the sky. And it actually reminded me that I had pulled out a poem that she had written, which I think that resonates, and if you permit me, because I think I just want to read it. It's from a poem called About a Crow. In a barren springtime field stands a woman dressed in black, crying her sisters' names like a bird in the empty sky. She'll cry them all out of herself. The one that flew away too soon, the one that had begged to die, the one that couldn't stop death, the one that has not stopped waiting, the one that has not stopped believing, the one that still grieves in silence, she'll cry them all into the ground as though sowing the field with pain. And from pain and the names of women, her new sisters will grow from the earth and again will sing joyfully of life. But what about her, the crow? She will stay in this field forever, because only this cry of hers holds all those swallows in the air. Do you hear how she calls each one by her name? Thank you very much.
very much, Eamon, for that. We're very touched. And finally, we're going to hear from Iván Briscoe. Ivan is the director of Latin America at International, or now Crisis Group. But more than that, he's one of the sharpest observers of Latin America and one of the most even-handed and good analysts I know. So, and if we have a few minutes at the end, Javi, we can answer a few questions if you're interested. Ivan, please.
Thank you very much, Sergio. It's really is a humbling experience to be with you and to hear what happened in Kramatorsk from you firsthand. I think Victoria and her compatriots might be a little bit shocked to learn how the issue of Ukraine and the war has complicated the summit, which has just finished here. We would expect, on the basis of the history of Latin America, that its governments democratic governments would join protests against war crimes and human rights abuses. But that hasn't happened, or has only happened partly, shall we say. So I'd like very briefly to try and understand a little bit better why Latin America seems to adopt the position it has. I've talked with numerous politicians, diplomats and experts in Latin America on this in recent months. Actually, while Sergio, Hector, Catalina and Victoria were on their ill-fated journey, I was in 3 separate Latin American capitals where this issue regularly arose. And the contrast between what happened to you and what I was listening to was sometimes stark. So I'd like just to briefly portray the logic of the Latin American stance in the hope that you will understand it as a serious and rational position, but I will suggest also ways to respond to it and draw attention to its fundamental weaknesses. But first of all, it's important to say that Latin America is not pro-Russian. Please, only Nicaragua voted against the UN motion to condemn the annexation of Ukrainian occupied territories last year. Some governments are clearly pro-Ukrainian, Guatemala amongst them. But it's true that while most condemn the invasion and the rupture of international law, they prefer to go little further. And there is certainly no desire to pursue sanctions, to provide military assistance to Ukraine. And 2 countries, Brazil and Mexico, stand out for championing a peace mediation in the conflict. So what underpins this particular stance? I think for almost all Latin American countries, the breakage of international law, the infringement of territorial sovereignty, the threat to peace were very clear and generated great support for the UN resolutions on the issue of the war. But it has to be said, over the last year in particular, there is a growing perception that there is what we might call a co-responsibility for the escalation and militarization of the war. This seems to ignore this perception, the NATO's own caution in avoiding escalation, which would bring NATO into the dispute. There is a strong perception in left-leaning countries in particular of the double standards of the West. I draw attention to the fact that Victoria has written herself about the complications of the relationship between Ukraine or Eastern European countries in general and the West, and the fact that the West and the United States are often unreliable suitors. But I think many Latin American diplomats have not just a university degree, but a master's and a doctorate in Western duplicity and hypocrisy, and mistrust calls to action from the West. They think there is an inconsistent application of human rights, respect for human rights, peace and international law. They think there is an inconsistent application of the demand for democratic standards in different countries around the world. And of course, I think particularly for the left, there are strong, deep memories of what the Cold War represented in Latin American countries, which of course produced many of the horrors which Sergio was describing earlier. And of course, with regard to Europe, there is a sense, and this was something Victoria was also aware of the difficulties of allowing so many Ukrainian refugees into Europe while making it difficult often for refugees from other conflicts around the world. I think in Latin America there's a perception that there's an urgent need for global cooperation on key issues for the world and for Latin America in particular: climate change, development, finance, public health, and that by generating blocks or demonizing Russia and China and other large countries, you are impeding that sort of cooperation. And I think lastly and very importantly, and Sergio drew attention to this, there's a very long and established Latin American history of building peace between states. Latin America is the region with the most bilateral and multilateral agreements related to the peaceful settlement of conflict in the world. It believes in arbitration and adjudication of disputes, and it believes that it brings to geopolitics its experience on these issues, and it should be listened to when it recommends to the world peace. But there are, of course, important weaknesses in all of this. I portray what I have heard. I portray what people say, very authoritative people on this subject. But there are clear weaknesses and loopholes here, which I think you as campaigners have to exploit at the very highest levels of government. There is a disgust with war across Latin America, but there's very little understanding of the causes of the war in Ukraine. Boric, the president of Chile, made very clear today in his presentation that Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia is responsible. There is no co-responsibility. Arming a country which is trying to defend itself, within limits, of course, is not making equal blame for the conflict, does not generate equal blame for the conflict. There are blind spots, as Sergio has clearly said, and particularly regarding the human rights abuses and war crimes taking place in Ukraine right now as a result of the invasion. There is a misunderstanding of sanctions. There is a sense that these are punitive sanctions similar to those which were exacted against Germany at the end of the First World War. This is a comparison I have heard again and again, and I think it's a responsibility of those imposing sanctions to make very clear that if the war ends and there is a settlement with the consent of Ukraine, then those sanctions would be lifted. But that is something which has to be communicated more clearly to governments in Latin America. But I'll just make one last, and I think this is a very significant point, which I think should be at the heart of all dealings with Latin American governments that resist, as it were, the Western line on Ukraine, which is that if they prize and cherish their ties to Moscow, then they should use them to press on the leaders of Russia the need to show a willingness to negotiate and a willingness to make concessions. We, so far, in Crisis Group, have seen no evidence that that is the case. And if Latin America wishes to maintain relations with all sides in a multipolar world, then it should meet its responsibilities in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivan. We have just very little time left. You've been very patient. I will just put a footnote, which is that our own movement is built around the idea of what we call common sense. And this is why you've seen around Brussels, an invasion is an invasion. And when you actually talk to people in Latin America, and when you actually see the polling of what people think, not the politicians, not the government, what the people in the street think, they don't think anything that's very different from anybody out here in Brussels, because it's obvious. And this is what we're trying to give voice to. Javier, why don't you manage the time and see how much? 5 minutes.
Sí, si os parece, lo que podría hacer, what I can do is a round of small questions or comments. If you have comments or questions. Okay, we will do a round, okay? Please.
Thank you very much. My name is Karen Melchior. I'm a Danish MEP, and I was actually in Bogota together with the Equality Committee, to look at gender equality and peace building. And I think Colombia can teach the world and especially Ukraine a lot. It has been very moving to be here. A week or so ago, we had an event regarding civilian prisoners, and also members of the RADA were there. And I think actually the experiences from Colombia on disappeared people would be very important to bring to Ukraine and have collaboration there. And I think also the situation of Colombia and the Colombian government with having a UN mission in Colombia that needs approval from Russia, of course, makes it difficult to speak out for the current government, but also perhaps puts them in a particularly important position to put pressure on Russia. So thank you so much for coming here and talking to us tonight.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Mark Angel.
Thank you very much. My name is Mark Angel. I'm Vice President of the Parliament here. I'm from the S&D Group and I'm from Luxembourg. I just looked in my calendar and I looked, where was I the 27th of June? And it seems that it was yesterday, and therefore this is yesterday, and you are here with the strengths and witnessing what you lived. I really think we're all overwhelmed by your strength and your courage. So first of all, thank you very much for coming here and for sharing with us. This is very important. Secondly, what we learned tonight is so important also because next week many of us will be in Madrid at the Euro-Lat. This is a interparliamentary meeting of parliamentarians of the European Union, of this parliament, with colleagues from Latin America and the Caribbean. And I think this gives us so much, and we have official meetings, but of course we have talks with colleagues, etc. And often we hear colleagues who try to tell us what you just said, that we have double standards, etc. And what I learned here today is, I think, very useful for all of us who will go to Madrid next week when we discuss with other colleagues. And so thank you so much for, I don't have a question, you were very clear and everything, but thank you so much for giving us these arguments and also your energy. I think your energy is coming up to us, and we will use this also to promote your cause. So thank you very much.
More comments? I would want to do a small comment, especially because, like, I feel when we talk with a lot of politicians, diplomats, because always we have the feeling that for this reason it's so useful, the work that the campaign is doing. No, it's unacceptable, but, and then a lot of things with this but, you know. And two elements that we have to try to explain is, first of all, I think Ukraine brings the discussion about the world order and what kind of world order we want to have, no? And this strange feeling that, well, a multipolar world and this narrative, a multipolar world that we are going to. And also like Latin America is really vocal on that. I think that Europe has to explain that a multipolar world without rules, with regional powers deciding about their neighbors, it will be an admire. An admire. Like a new multipolar world doesn't mean a better world automatically. It's not like that. And the best example about this is Ukraine. It's the best example. And secondly, the mindset about the Cold War, this is also really important. No? I think like the heritage about the non-aligned countries and this element that it's there, no? And then, and I think it's a complete misunderstanding about what it was meaning, what it mean to be non-aligned. The non-aligned movement, it was basically anti-colonial movement, basically. And what we are facing in Ukraine, it's a colonial behavior, like an imperial act. And we have to explain that the non-aligned movement use the heritage, the cultural, political heritage of the non-aligned movement in the world, like should denounce and reject completely what is happening in Ukraine. And we have to explain this to our colleagues from Latin America.
I think our time is up. The ambassador wants to say something.
Yes, just to thank you personally, Sergio, and all speakers today and organizers, but not only for today's event, for all you have been doing for the last, I think, half a year, right, or even more. One could think that it's a long time, but indeed, you did a lot during this very limited time. I mean, you managed to get together really prominent, important personalities in Latin America, Caribbean region. And what is important that you are reaching out to the people and to explain in a very simple words, in very simple categories, what is right, what is wrong, what is human and what is inhuman, what is criminal. And you really complicate situation for Russia because they try to operate very general concepts and turn people's head around, and they are quite strong in that. And your approach is really winning one, and we also have to learn a lot from you and use this. I don't want to say methods, because it's not a method, it's just telling the truth in our regions and continents. And it's indeed about what kind of world we are going to live tomorrow. It's a world of lie, manipulation, and divisions, or to build our future together. Thank you.
If you either want one sentence to close us off.
Pues I want to say that I was in Colombia after Ukraine. And before I went to Ukraine, I thought that Colombia was one of the worst places in the world. Terrible, insecure, streets, violence, paramilitaries, robberies, everything. But then after Ukraine, I felt so safe at home. And I appreciated very much when people in Colombia could say that we were NATO enviados, NATO envoys, that we were CIA accomplices working in Ukraine, or that they could say that really, as some bloggers in the Russian part, that they say, oh, it was the Ukrainian army who first put the bomb in the Kramatorsk pizzeria. So all these lies could be said openly in Colombia, and I think that's fine. When in a country you can lie freely, but you can say that is a lie, that is a big lie, it's beautiful. We need that. We need a country, even my country, when people like that mad people that really think that we are NATO envoys, it's okay. That's the example of Europe. You can say whatever you want, but then you have to confront reality, and you have to confront what is a lie and what is the truth. So, and what is a war of two big armies? What is a war when you are destroying totally cities, when you are taking children to another place, like the Argentinians did with children, but now in an amount that you cannot imagine. So I was happy in Colombia, and I'm going back tomorrow to Colombia to defend what we have there.
One last.
I just was watching today an interview with Victoria months ago. Then I asked her what Latin Americans could do to help Ukrainians. And she said, listen, I understand that Latin Americans will not give us arms, and it's fine. but they will never forget that with pressure, it's important for us. They need to put pressure on Russia, supporting sanctions and putting pressure. This is the way everyone can help, is what you say.
So thank you very much, all of you, for coming. Javi, really were so moved by the fact that on this day, everything is so busy, so many things are happening, and there's still space for us. I will just say one final word about Victoria, because this is, above all, a tribute to Victoria we want to do today, and that is, the more I think of her as a kind of great interpreter of Ukraine. She understood that despite what you see in the news, the world really wasn't understanding what's going on. As a young person, she spent some years in Canada. She spoke English very well. I think this gave her an advantage. But this is what we need to do. We need to get the evidence out, and we need to call things by their name if this is going to end. I am of the opinion myself that the war is only going to end when the people in the Kremlin understand that all the doors have been closed, and they're closed by showing the evidence and showing what accountability means to this criminal regime. It is very odd because Héctor and I really knew Victoria. I'd met her before, I was in touch with her, but in the end, very briefly, just a short week. And she actually every day becomes, the more we know about her, she becomes a better and better friend, and we admire her more, and it's a terrible, terrible loss